My dear people, hello. I'm directly speaking to you from the sacristy here in Clyde, New York. And Father Tedeschi and I thought it would be a good idea if we addressed some of the questions that you are probably having during this time. Could well be that you've had them addressed by other priests or other people on the internet, but it's always good to hear from your own priest. I think one of the most important questions that good people like you are asking is, what do we do at this moment when we don't go to Mass? And you know, and I will remind you right now, that Father Tedeschi and I say Mass, we offer Mass privately without any of the faithful present every morning. And both Father Tedeschi and I offered each of the Masses of the Holy Triduum, of the Sacred Triduum of Easter, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, the Easter Vigil. We offered those as well. So the question is, you are not able to go to Mass. Why are Father Tedeschi and I then still offering our Masses? And this is an important thing to understand, because it helps us in this odd time realize the power of the Mass, what the Mass is, even if the faithful cannot be present at it. Now, first of all, this is not a pass, a free pass, not to have to go to Mass when we normally can go to Mass. So everything I'm about to say is not an excuse to avoid going to Mass. But the principle is that the Mass is powerful as a prayer in and of itself, even if no one but the priest is present, because the Mass is the greatest and the most powerful prayer at all. Why is this? Because the Mass is the prayer of our blessed Lord himself. It is the perfect prayer. What is the Mass? Well, we have to remember the Mass is more than just a community gathering or a community meal. The Mass is the sacrifice of our Lord on the cross, except it is not done in a bloody manner as our Lord offered himself to the Father on the cross, but it is mystically represented in an unbloody manner. It is not a separate sacrifice. It is the same sacrifice as a sacrifice on the cross. So every time we assist at Holy Mass, we are assisting at our Lord's perfect sacrifice on the cross. Now, when our Lord gave himself on the cross, who was the priest? Jesus Christ himself. And who was the victim? Meaning, who or what was offered to God on behalf of the sins of mankind? Jesus again. So in every Mass, the true and real priest is Jesus, and the true and real victim, meaning who or what is offered to God on behalf of mankind for sins, is Jesus in both cases. Now on the cross, Jesus himself was offered, plain and simple, and in a bloody way, as we all know from looking at crucifixes. But in the Mass, our Lord is offered, he offers himself in an unbloody manner through the ministry of his priests. Now, when we understand this, we realize that the power of the Mass is far more than the power of the individual priest's prayers. The Mass is Christ's prayer to God, and that's why it's the perfect prayer. And that's also why it's so important when we can, under normal circumstances, to go to Mass and to pray it. But then the question remains, well, what about now when faithful can't be present at Mass? Well, think about it for a moment. Our Lord, when he offered himself on the cross, paid for the sins of all of mankind and won in that single act all of the graces that would flow from the church, flow to the church until the end of time. So the Mass is of infinite value because it has the infinite value of the sacrifice of the cross, which means that even if you cannot be present at the Mass that the priest is offering, when the priest is offering Mass for you, as Father Tedeschi and I are doing now, you are getting those graces that come from the Mass being offered. Now, does this mean we shouldn't go to Mass? Of course not. Because normally, and again I say under ordinary circumstances, For us to get those graces that come from the Mass, we have to be present, normally physically at it, and we have to unite ourselves to what is happening on the altar with faith and love. And that's what you do normally when you come to Mass. So, for example, were someone to come to Mass and be playing games on their cell phone throughout the Mass and not pay attention, well, they wouldn't get graces because they're not praying and they're not participating in the Mass. But now, you cannot go to Mass as normal. So what can you do? Well, you can, as you are doing, I assume, you are watching or you're participating, so to speak, spiritually in Masses that you see on the internet or on television. And so you're uniting yourselves in faith to what is happening on, so to speak, the television or computer screen. But you're not watching it like a television show, you are praying along. So when I say that Father Tedeschi and I are offering Masses for you every day, even though you can't be present at these Masses, we are praying for you. And the power of the Mass is much, much greater than the power of the individual priest. And so we are praying, and I ask you to pray too, that these graces that we are, so to speak, winning for you by offering the Mass, it's our Lord who gets them for us, that these graces flow to you. And so you can have great hope and great consolation that even though you're not able to attend Mass as normal, God is being honored by the perfect sacrifice of Jesus in the Eucharist, and also that you, so to speak, have a spiritual bank account that God is still offering you through your two priests, Father Tedeschi and myself, that you can access or you can withdraw from through prayer. And that's what you have to remind yourself. Now, does this mean that we should never have to go to Mass because the Mass is powerful in of itself? No, we should, because that's how we normally get graces. But because now we are prevented from going to Mass, we can get those graces in its own way. Now, a second point, you might say, well, what about Holy Communion? Well, here's something that sometimes we've forgotten in our day. The Mass is, again, valuable for us even if we do not necessarily receive Holy Communion at that Mass. Now, receiving Holy Communion is the most perfect way to participate and to receive in the Mass and to receive its fruits. But we have to remember that for many centuries in the Church, most people did not communicate, meaning they did not receive Holy Communion at many of the Masses they went to. They received Holy Communion much less frequently. So this means that it is still fruitful for us, it's still possible, and it's still good for us to get spiritual blessings, to go to Mass and to pray at Mass, even if we cannot receive Holy Communion. So that's in and of itself. Remember, the Mass exists as the perfect prayer, even if not everybody goes to Holy Communion. Well, this is helpful for us now because it shows that we can still get blessings from the Mass, even if we don't receive communion at it. But here is the added trick that we can do. Here's a little spiritual jewel. I'm sure you've heard other priests or other people talk about it either on the internet or in one of my bulletin letters, and that is to offer a spiritual communion. Because what happens in Holy Communion is that we unite ourselves with Jesus and with the power of his saving death and with the power of his glorious resurrection. Obviously, if we were to receive Holy Communion and not recognize that it's Jesus, or we were to not receive it in a state of grace, or were we to not receive Jesus lovingly, were we to be indifferent, we wouldn't get the graces. So the point of receiving communion sacramentally under normal circumstances is that we open our hearts, our souls are clean, and that we receive Jesus with love. But when we cannot receive Jesus sacramentally, our Lord is too good to keep us from him in himself to us. So what we can do is we can offer a spiritual communion. When we cannot go to Holy Communion sacramentally, we can unite ourselves with our Lord spiritually. How do we do this? We make a simple prayer and any words we choose, but there are formulas which says in so many words, Jesus, I cannot receive you sacramentally now, but I acknowledge you as truly present in the most blessed sacrament, body, blood, soul, and divinity, and I invite you into my heart spiritually so that I may be united to you. And then often these prayers say something like, Jesus, I recognize you as already there. I unite myself to you. And we can spend a moment or two in silent prayer with our Lord, who is with us spiritually. Now, many of the saints recommend frequent spiritual communions. In fact, the great St. Alphonsus Liguori recommended that people make spiritual communions even many times a day. He said one of the best ways to prepare for sacramental communion is to make spiritual communions, because obviously if throughout the day we're inviting our Lord into our heart, we're acknowledging his real presence in the Blessed Sacrament, it makes perfect sense that the moment when we can receive our Lord in Holy Communion, we'll do so with great love. All of this to say that the graces of the Mass and the graces of Jesus in Holy Communion are still available to you if you open your heart. Why? Because Father Tedeschi and I are offering Masses every day, a single Mass, every day for you, our people, who are spiritual sheep. And those graces are available because the power of the Mass is infinite. You have to open your heart up to them, and as I said, use this spiritual bank account that God has given you through the celebration of the Mass. Make a withdrawal by praying and asking for those graces. And then those moments when you do watch a Mass on TV by one of your priests, by the bishop, by a priest anywhere throughout the world, if you can make a spiritual communion, ask Jesus to unite himself to you and yourself to him by coming into your heart spiritually and acknowledging his real presence. One of the graces of this time is that it gives us a longing for the Holy Eucharist, and it makes us realize the power of the Mass. As a priest, even though I am alone in the little chapel offering my Mass, I know that the power of this Mass can reach to the ends of the earth, because it is the power of Jesus Christ in his death on the cross. Jesus is our eternal priest, interceding for us before the throne of grace in heaven. He loves us infinitely, and he is always waiting to give to our souls the fruits of his sacred passion. He died out of love for us to bring us to heaven. The Eucharist is the gate of heaven. May we always open our hearts to walk through this gate and remember that Jesus, our good shepherd, is as close to us as we want him to be. He is as close as a simple prayer, asking him into our hearts, because in the end, he is waiting for us to ask. God bless you.